Previously on For Wild's Sake.
Courtesy of Lone Pine, California.
The breaking news, stay at home. That is the order tonight from 4 state governors.
Out with the old, in with the new.
Please listen carefully.
The last 6 months had been, well, kind of a whirlwind. We'd left our home, moved into a vehicle, driven from coast to coast, seen a lifetime's worth of natural wonders, and all before being locked down in a family member's vacant home for 6 weeks while we waited for public lands to reopen. Let loose, and once again free to roam, we were feeling tentatively recharged. But the country at large was still reeling from the sudden onset of a new normal. It had been over half a year since we felt the cold, rushing waters of a trout stream around our ankles. And though we'd been willfully distracted by the charismatic deserts of the Southwest, the coming of spring brought with it a familiar magnetic pull, luring us back to the mountains. Many of you watching this may not realize, as we certainly didn't, that Arizona, a state best known for its monumental rock spires, lowland deserts, and deep canyons, has a remarkably varied landscape, even laying claim to the largest ponderosa pine stand in the world. Smack dab in the middle, and running diagonally across the state, is a transition zone between the southern desert basins and the towering Colorado Plateau to the north. Within it is contained Arizona's largest mountain ranges, boasting peaks over 12,000 feet. That's where we were heading, to the White Mountains on the far eastern side of the state, where lush hillsides fed by cold springs and seasonal snowmelt create the U.S.'s southernmost habitat where inland trout can survive.
I don't think they want to play with you.
We were on the hunt for one of the rarest salmonids in the world, the unique and elusive Oncorhynchus apache, or as it's commonly known, the Apache trout. In the world of trout, Apache trout's genetic lineage is ancient. At some point, between 500,000 and 1 million years ago, rainbow trout-like ancestors of the Apache pushed their way inland, colonizing the upper reaches of the Salt and Little Colorado rivers, where they've remained to this day, evolving to survive in a unique and challenging environment and distinguishing themselves from their forebears. When we consider the fact that they've flourished since the Pleistocene, it's all the more dramatic that within 50 years of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, they were almost lost forever. By the second half of the 20th century, their original 600 miles of stream habitat was reduced to less than 30, and the Apache trout became the first fish to be listed under the newly constructed Endangered Species Act, closing all remaining stream miles to angling and beginning the long and uncertain process of a species revival. By 1975, restoration efforts had been successful enough to downlist the species to threatened, carving out small provisions for angling in hopes that it might generate public interest in the fish and encourage continued resource allocation and conservation efforts. And that, in a nutshell, is the conundrum that aquatic species often face. They aren't seen or heard by the general public.
Trout conservation lies in a paradox where it's really hard to get the funding for the research or the restoration work or, any kind of conservation practice you can think of relies fairly heavily on money that comes from the sales of fishing licenses and rods and reels. And conservation needs anglers. They're important advocates for conservation, and in some communities, maybe they're the only advocates that are actually speaking up and talking about these waters. I guess, you have other user groups like boaters and stuff, but really when it comes to the fish and direct advocacy for the fish, that's a really important user group.
Fish aren't easily appreciated by wildlife enthusiasts because unlike their terrestrial or avian counterparts, they can't be easily observed. And as the old adage goes, out of sight, out of mind. The average American's relationship to trout is most likely confined to the edges of a dinner plate, a value that's universally understood. But what about the populations that are too delicate to sustain harvest? For better or worse, catch and release angling provides a tangible connection between people and fish, allowing the angler to gain an intimate understanding of the given fish's habitat, habits, and nutrient webs, as well as allowing for a close and detailed look at the animal itself. If done with care, these brief encounters between the surface and subsurface world can forge meaningful and lasting relationships between people and fish. Relationships that, despite their confusing and often contradictory nature, could lead to each other's mutual survival. That's what we were here to do. To observe a living thing. A thing that exists nowhere else but right here, and that desperately needs our attention before it's too late. Now all we had to do was find it.
What do you got?
Just, granola bar. Old granola bar.
Old granola bar.
In typical form, our eagerness to stretch our legs and get back outside found us entering Apache National Forest early. A little too early, in fact. If the snow drifts along the trail were an indication enough, then the high and discolored water flowing over the banks of the tiny streams where we hoped to find the trout were a dead giveaway. It was no small feat driving the van up the steep, winding roads to reach these alpine meadows, so we weren't about to just throw in the towel. So we did what any self-respecting anglers would do, and fished. And fished. And fished.
I feel like it's just getting higher by the second.
I feel like there's definitely a fish in here.
Inaccessible.
But also, there's like 2 more miles we can hike.
It had all the components of a trout angler's paradise. Endless expanse of remote yet accessible country, cold, clean water running through picturesque alpine meadows, and miles of river all to ourselves.
Yeah, you can see where we are. There's the road.
The only thing that seemed to be missing was the fish.
What do we do?
Keep hiking.
Our initial research had put us here, where we could gather was the most likely place to catch an Apache trout, and one that Arizona's Game and Fish heavily promotes as a recreational fishery. In hindsight, the lack of other anglers should have been a sign that something was a little off. In fact, it would be several weeks until the sun had baked off the lion's share of winter's snow from the high peaks, and flows would return to their seasonal normal.
Spent the last 2 days fishing 2 different headwater streams. Man, the water was high. We didn't even see a fish. We're kind of at a loss of what to do, and the timing should have been right, but looks like runoff came early. It's unseasonably hot. Seems to happen more and more every year. It's harder to predict. We talked to a couple other people out hiking, and they say it's the highest they've ever seen the river. It's hard to be too disappointed because it's just achingly beautiful up here. I don't think either one of us was really expecting what we found when we got here. So it's hard to want to move because we're just enjoying our time here so much, even though the fishing hasn't been very good.
I think it's spring fed, but right now it's obviously getting extra water from runoff and snowmelt, but it's, diminutive now. It's a small little stream. I wonder in the peak of the summer how small it gets, or if it stays like relatively stable from the spring water. Because if it's like semi-ephemeral, if it just dries up in the summer, I don't know that fish would necessarily move into this fork.
All right, now put some coffee down, drink it again without talking.
We probably could have continued to beat the water to death, but as a general rule, we like to let nature's internal clock set the pace. And don't get me wrong, we wanted to catch an Apache trout as bad as anyone. But in the end, we decided that good things will undoubtedly come to those who wait. We had more of the Southwest still to explore and more native trout to chase after, so we decided to jump ship to the east while we waited for winter to release its icy grip on Arizona. To kill a couple of weeks, we planned a route through New Mexico's Carson National Forest, where we hope to find another fish on our list and still have time to make it back to Arizona.
That's gonna be good. Bon appetit.
The history of New Mexico is essentially the history of the United States as we know it, as the Conquistadores became the first Europeans to reach the interior nearly 500 years ago. Lusting after Cibola, the mythical Seven Cities of Gold, Francisco de Coronado led a historic expedition through Arizona and New Mexico, becoming the first Westerners to observe the Grand Canyon and Colorado River. The expedition was ultimately deemed a failure when it fell short on its promise of gold, but while traversing the mountains outside of current-day Santa Fe, Coronado found something else. A small and colorful trout dancing in the cold, clear pools of the Pecos River. That trout was what we now refer to as the Rio Grande Cutthroat trout, native to the headwaters of the Rio Grande, Pecos, and Canadian rivers, and once occupying a range that extended all the way to West Texas. It's the southernmost extant species of cutthroat, and like all of its nearest cousins, it's struggling to survive in a world that's undergone significant changes since Coronado and his men first described it in 1541. The native Pueblo people, a name meaning town given to them by the Spanish explorers for their beautifully constructed sedentary cities, have had a relationship with the cutthroat for what they consider time immemorial.
Even before Coronado got here, that resource has always been available and present to the native people. Some of the stories that they share, the abundance and presence of cutthroat trout was phenomenal. At that time, that was the only species present. When I worked with Santa Clara Pueblo, their view was this fish has always been occupying this area. And so it's something they want to continue to see, that persist through time so that generations to come can have that experience of seeing a species like that.
But if you're familiar with the history that European colonization has had on North America's native fishes, you'll know that the Rio Grande's fate was sealed the moment the Conquistadors first laid eyes on them. The range of the Rio Grande has been shrinking rapidly over the last few centuries, becoming completely extirpated from Texas and now comprising only 10% of its historic distribution. Once again, the introduction of invasive trout proved more than the Rio Grandes could handle.
Non-native trout species are the primary threat to all cutthroat trout subspecies. In real time, as we speak, it's those interactions that are having tangible, measurable negative impacts on these populations. And that's been demonstrated over and over and over again.
Couple that with unfettered livestock grazing and habitat loss from human development, and the unique cutthroat species has suffered a rapid decline. we finally made it to the headwaters of the Rio Grande, we were relieved to find some slightly more forgiving water conditions. But that didn't mean that the fishing would be any easier. Fishing in small, wild streams like this is a far cry from the large, open waters of the mainstem rivers most people think of when they think of fly fishing. Casting is mostly restricted to small, vegetation-choked pockets of open water, and techniques like the bow and arrow cast become the primary tool for reaching the surface. The first few miles of stream proved fruitless, aside from a few wild brown trout continuing their slow, methodical invasion from downstream. The information we dug up on this stream was almost 10 years old. Maybe we were too late. Refusing to take no for an answer, we pushed farther upstream. The brush got thicker and the fishable pools fewer. Eventually, we made it past some large natural waterfalls which could keep the downstream brown trout at bay. Every creek is different, and this one in particular had very few fish, which were spread far apart. This low density of trout means lots of walking, and even more importantly, a keen eye for fish spotting.
I see a giant fish and it just ate off the surface. I'm trying not to freak out. It's right there.
With so few trout to choose from, casting blindly is a waste of time. Spotting and stalking individual fish was our best chance of success. But spotting the fish is only half the battle. Much like their nearest cousins, the Colorado River and greenback cutthroat, Rio Grandes possess the potential to achieve vibrant coloration with fiery hues of deep red, brilliant orange, and rich golden ochres. But the expression of these traits is often closely tied to localized environmental factors, and the pale substrate and snowmelt-tinged water of this particular stream produce trout with unique and beautiful flanks covered in large and unusual paw marks. Once we dialed in the approach and equipment, we were able to spot and land a few more healthy Rio Grandes.
for a lot of these cutthroat subspecies, remember that as a result of non-native trout introductions, they are annexed like princesses and towers in these headwaters.
And we are seeing populations like blinking out, but there is reason to be optimistic. You know, if we can find these populations that are flourishing and rally around them and do what we can to protect them, then there is cause for hope.
With more miles under our belt than fish landed, we made our way back out of the mountains and onto the road. Reports from back in Apache country were looking promising, and we had several days of travel still ahead. Next time on For Wild's Sake.